My mother said that while my father turned the padlock on the boathouse door, and my 8-year-old son sat down on a cold concrete step in the dark with his knees pulled to his chest. Wyatt stayed out there for 2 hours and 40 minutes while a lake-effect squall dropped the wind chill to 11 degrees, until a paramedic wrapped him in a silver blanket in the back of an ambulance 3 blocks from my parents' marina. When I climbed into that ambulance and saw my son's lips the color of a bruise, my mother was already telling the responding deputy that Wyatt had wandered off on his own. She did not know the boathouse had a security camera my father installed 2 winters ago to watch the boat lifts. She did not know I had already pulled the footage onto my phone. She did not know what I do for a living. My name is Jo Callahan. I'm 33 years old and I examine video for a living. I tell judges and juries whether the footage in front of them is real or whether somebody cut it, spliced it, or built it out of pieces to sell a lie. If a family has ever handed you a story that didn't match what your own child told you, stay with me to the end. Welcome back to Paper Trail Justice. Comment where you're watching from and subscribe. Because what my mother didn't understand that night was that I don't just believe evidence. I build it, I test it, and when it's fake, I can prove exactly how. I have a rule at the lab. When I'm processing a case, my phone goes into a locker in the cleanroom hallway. Chain of custody means no outside device touches a bench holding original media, and it means I can't have a phone buzzing next to a hard drive that a defense attorney is going to ask about under oath in 6 months. For 6 years, that rule cost me nothing that mattered. On November 14th, it cost me 2 hours and 40 minutes of not knowing where my son was. I should tell you about Dean first, because none of this makes sense without him. My husband is a staff sergeant in the Michigan Army National Guard, a combat engineer, which makes him, among other things, the most methodical person I have ever met about doors, locks, and the difference between a door that's locked and a door that only looks locked. He was 2 weeks into a 3-week annual training rotation at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, when the storm hit Petoskey. He gets phone access most evenings, but not during field exercises, and on the 14th he had none at all. My son's worst night happened in the one window when neither of his parents could be reached. Dean and I live in Traverse City, 40 minutes south of my parents' place on Walloon Lake. Wyatt is 8. He is quiet in the particular way of a kid who has learned that being quiet keeps him out of trouble, a thing I noticed and then, God help me, filed away instead of acting on. The work I do is not glamorous, whatever true crime documentaries make it look like. Most weeks I sit at a dual-monitor workstation comparing hash values on a security clip a divorce attorney wants thrown out, or testifying that a doorbell camera's timestamp really does mean what the prosecution says it means. The month before the storm, I'd spent 11 days on a custody case in Kalkaska County, proving that a father's concerned neighbor footage of the mother had been recorded on a phone held up to a laptop screen. The same trick, as it turned out, my own mother would later try on me. I flew home from that deposition thinking I'd seen the worst version of what people do to children when they want a story to be true. I had not yet met the worst version. She lived 1 floor above my parents' garage, in the room she'd grown up in. My parents are Roland and Debbie Kessler. My father ran a marina and boat repair shop on Walloon Lake for 31 years before he sold the business and kept the house and the boathouse. He can rebuild an outboard motor blindfolded, and he measures a person's worth by whether they show up on time and keep their tools clean. My mother ran the front office. She's the kind of woman who plans the Thanksgiving seating chart 3 weeks out and remembers everyone's coffee order, and has never, in 33 years, remembered mine. Between them, they raised 2 daughters. My sister Marisol is 3 years older than me. She's the daughter who did everything in the expected order, married an ad sales director named Grant Ford in 2015, bought a house with a paver driveway outside Grand Rapids, and posted about all of it. I'm the daughter who joined the Army Reserve out of high school for the tuition money, went to school for digital media forensics, and married an enlisted combat engineer. My mother has spent a decade being polite about that choice in a tone that makes clear it isn't the one she'd have picked for me. There are 14 framed photographs on the built-in shelves in my parents' living room. I counted them once on a Sunday when Wyatt was 6 and bored and counting things with me. Marisol's wedding, Marisol pregnant, Paisley's birth, Paisley's baptism, Paisley in a recital costume, 3 different years of the Kessler Christmas card, Paisley front and center every time. Wyatt appears in exactly one, half turned away, laughing at something outside the frame. He counted with me. He didn't ask why there were so few of him. I didn't explain, because I didn't yet have the words for what I was seeing. Marisol's marriage ended in September. Grant filed after he found out she'd run up almost $11,000 in an online sports book over 18 months, some of it drawn from a joint line of credit he never knew she'd opened. He kept the house. He kept primary custody of Paisley on paper, pending a court-ordered evaluation, with Marisol getting alternating weekends. By October, Marisol had moved back into her childhood bedroom on Walloon Lake, 9-year-old daughter, and all 3 weeks after I'd started dropping Wyatt off there on the Saturdays, I picked up overtime cases at the lab. My mother called it a season of grace for Marisol. In early November, she asked if I could keep Wyatt home for the family's regular Sunday dinner, just this once, so your sister isn't reminded of what she's lost. My son was 8. My sister was 36. I said yes, because I didn't yet know what saying yes had already cost him on the Saturdays before that. That's the story I want to tell you from the beginning, because by the time I understood what was happening to my son in that house, I already had the tools to prove it. I just hadn't turned them on my own family yet. I was about to. ACT2, the first thing I noticed and didn't act on was the hand warmers. In late September, Wyatt started asking me to buy the little foil packets of hot hands from the sporting goods aisle, the kind hunters use. I bought a box of 40 without asking why an 8-year-old wanted them. By the 3rd week of October, his teacher, Ms. Renata Ostrowski, who has taught 2nd grade at Pedosky Elementary for 16 years, called me at 4:40 on a Tuesday. Mrs. Callahan, I need to ask you something. Wyatt's been keeping hand warmer packets in his backpack. Not 1 or 2, I counted 19 last week, in the front pocket, some of them already used and cold. I noticed because one had leaked and stained his library book. That night I went through his backpack. 19 packets, some spent, some still sealed, tucked into the lining like a squirrel's cache. I asked him why. In case Grandma sends me outside again and it's cold, he said, not looking up from his cereal. I want to have some ready. I told myself he meant the doc. I told myself it was a game. I did not, that night, ask him how many times again had already been. The drawings started around the same time. Before September, Wyatt drew boats, pontoons, his dad's guard Humvee, a submarine with a periscope shaped like a straw. After September, he started drawing a small boat frozen into a block of ice, drawn as a careful rectangle around the hull, with bigger boats floating free around it. In November, he drew one I still have, taped inside a folder I now keep in a fire safe. The little iced-in boat is smiling. I asked him why it was smiling. Because it knows the ice melts eventually, he said. I did not ask him what that meant. I know now he was telling me the only way an 8-year-old knows how. I should have read that drawing the way I read a hard drive. Literally, patiently, assuming there was information in it I hadn't yet decoded. I am trained to do exactly that for strangers' children in custody disputes. I did not do it for my own son. In late October, I noticed the photograph. There's a framed picture on my parents' mantle from a family boat day in 2019. Dean at the wheel of my dad's old Chris-Craft, me next to him. Wyatt on my lap in a life vest too big for him. For years it hung in the front hallway, all 3 of us in it. Sometime that fall it moved to the mantle, in the same frame, the same matting. Only it wasn't all 3 of us anymore. Dean had been cropped out. My mother told me the original had water damage and she'd had it reprinted from a backup file. I nodded. I did not ask where a backup file of a printed photograph comes from. I drove home and didn't think about it again until I had a reason to. Our neighbor at the lake, Alma Petrakis, is 74, a retired postal carrier who has lived next door to my parents since before I was born. In the first week of November, she caught me getting Wyatt out of the car and said, "That boy of yours is out on the dock an awful lot for November, Josephine. Sweetest thing, sits right out there by the boathouse with his coat zipped up to his chin. Doesn't complain once." I stopped with my hand on the car door. "How long does he sit out there, Alma?" "Oh, an hour, sometimes closer to 2. I figured your mother liked him getting his fresh air." My mother had told me Wyatt was inside playing with Paisley. Alma had watched my son sit alone on a dock in 40-degree weather for 6 weeks. I drove the rest of the way home with my jaw so tight it ached. I asked Wyatt in the rearview mirror if he liked sitting on the dock at Grandma's. Sometimes when Grandma has people over, she says I'm too loud inside, he said. I'm not loud, Mom. I don't know how to be quiet enough for Grandma. In the first week of November, I finally did the one useful thing I'd managed all fall. I called a child therapist in Traverse City named Dr. Priya Kapoor, no relation to the doctor who'd later treat Wyatt at the ER, a coincidence I only noticed weeks afterward, and asked about an evaluation for anxiety. Her first opening was December 3rd. I took it, and then I did the thing I am least proud of in this entire story. I let myself feel like booking the appointment had already solved something. I told myself I'd keep watching closely until then, that 3.5 weeks was a reasonable amount of time to wait, that nothing was urgent enough to jump the line ahead of families with worse emergencies than a quiet kid and some hand warmers. I built a plan with a date on it and let the date do the worrying for me. The storm did not consult my calendar. It came 13 days early. I did not sleep much that night. I told myself I'd raise it at Thanksgiving. I did not yet know there wasn't going to be a Thanksgiving before there was a police report. Once I finally started looking, the pattern was there waiting to be read, the same way a doctored file always leaves a seam if you know where to look. I opened the Notes app on my phone that night and started what I've since labeled, with the particular gallows humor of my profession, the Walloon Lake log. I scrolled back through 5 months of my mother's texts. 6 separate accusations against Wyatt since June, a missing $5 bill from her purse, a scratched CD case that turned out to be Paisley's own doing, a broken picture frame, a missing hair clip, a borrowed video game controller that surfaced under Paisley's own bed 3 weeks later with no apology attached. In every single one, the missing item was found in Wyatt's bag or never found at all. In not one of the 6 was Paisley asked a direct question about it in front of anyone. I am trained to notice when a body of evidence only ever points one direction. I had been looking at 6 months of exactly that and calling it a rough patch. Paisley's 9th birthday fell in the middle of October, 3 weeks before my father's party. My mother rented a face painting service and invited 22 children. Paisley unwrapped a tablet, a pair of AirPods, and a real gold-plated bracelet with her name engraved on the clasp. Wyatt, whose birthday isn't until March, wasn't owed a present at all, but my mother handed him a small wrapped box anyway, so he doesn't feel left out, and told the room, loudly enough for both children to hear, that she'd gotten him something sensible since he's the practical one. It was a 3-pack of tube socks from the drugstore down the road. Wyatt said thank you. He held the socks in his lap the rest of the party the way you'd hold something you were embarrassed to be holding. In the car afterward, he asked me, very quietly, if he'd done something wrong that year. I told him no, that Grandma just liked practical gifts sometimes. I was lying, and some part of him already knew it, because he didn't ask again. He just filed it, the way I would later learn. He'd been filing everything else. The other thing building that fall was my father's 70th birthday. He'd spent 30 years talking about a fly fishing trip to the Kenai Peninsula, and that October the family, aunts, uncles, marina customers who'd become friends over 3 decades, started a cash collection to send him and my mother to Alaska the following summer. My mother kept the envelope in the coat closet by the mudroom, in a decorative tin that used to hold my grandfather's fishing lures. By the second week of November, it held $4,300 in cash and a stack of checks. I want to be fair to my father here, because this story is not as simple as one villain and one victim, and he does not stay the man he was on the night of the 14th. Before any of this, he was the grandparent who taught Wyatt to tie a bowline knot at 5 years old and never once raised his voice doing it, who let Wyatt help refinish the Chris Crafts bright work every August even though a 7-year-old with a sanding block slows the job down by half a day, who called Wyatt first mate instead of his name for an entire summer because Wyatt had asked him to. Whatever he became capable of doing on a Saturday night in November, it did not erase 8 years of a man who genuinely loved his grandson in the only language he'd ever been taught to use: competence, usefulness, showing up. It just meant that when my mother handed him a story that flattered that language, he didn't look past it the way he should have. There was one more thing in that closet: my grandfather's gold Bulova pocket watch, engraved on the case back R.K. Iwo Jima, 1945, for my great-grandfather, passed down to my father, and promised, my father had said this at every family dinner for a year, to Wyatt on his 16th birthday, because he's the only one who ever asks to hear the story twice. My father kept it in a velvet box in that same coat closet, out for the party season so he could show it off to birthday guests. Paisley had asked to hold it in October. My father had let her, once, supervised. The birthday kickoff dinner was set for Saturday, November 14th. 18 people RSVP'd. My mother ordered a sheet cake from the bakery in town and hired a high school kid to grill. I dropped Wyatt off at 10 that morning because I had a subpoenaed deposition in Grand Rapids I couldn't move, and I told myself I would be back by 6, well before dinner. The National Weather Service had already issued a lake-effect snow squall watch for Emmett and Charlevoix counties, wind gusts to 50 miles an hour, whiteout conditions possible after dark. I remember thinking the drive home might be rough. I did not think even once that the danger that night would be inside my parents' house and not on the road. Act 3. I didn't make it back by 6. The deposition ran long, then I-75 north of Cadillac was down to one lane behind a jackknifed semi, and I didn't pull into my parents' driveway until 8:40 p.m. 40 minutes after the squall had already started dropping an inch of snow every 20 minutes, and the wind had started to howl off the lake in long, low gusts that rocked my car on the causeway. The house was strung with a banner that said Happy 70th Roland when I walked in, snow already sticking to my shoulders, the smell of brisket and bakery frosting thick in the front hall. My father was laughing with Kurt DeVries by the fireplace. My mother was refilling a coffee urn. Somewhere in the back of the house, I could hear Paisley's voice, high and delighted, and I remember feeling, for exactly 90 seconds, that the whole overreacting, watchful part of the fall might have just been me being tired and unfair to my own family. I hung my coat in the mudroom closet, 3 feet from the empty velvet box no one had told me about yet, and went to find my son. By the time I walked in, the party was already a crime scene I didn't know existed yet. Here is what I've since pieced together from the Boathouse camera, the mudroom camera my father also installed 2 winters ago, and 11 separate conversations. At 7:15 p.m., my father brought the velvet box out of the coat closet to show a marina customer named Kurt DeVries the watch. He set the box on the hallway table while he refilled Kurt's coffee. At 7:19, Paisley, who had been circling that table all evening, opened the box, took the watch out, and put it in the pocket of her hoodie. The mudroom camera caught all of it in a wide, grainy, unmistakable shot, a 9-year-old girl alone in the hallway for 11 seconds. At 7:31, my father went to put the watch away for the night and found the box empty. He didn't panic quietly. He called out to the room. My mother searched the coat closet, then the hall table, then, oddly specifically, Wyatt's backpack, which was sitting by the door because he'd brought his overnight bag for the sleepover his cousin's visit was supposed to include. She came out of that search with a look on her face I've since learned to recognize as a woman finalizing a decision she'd already made weeks earlier. At 7:52, my mother announced to the room that the watch was missing. At 7:54, Marisol, performing, I'd learn, for an audience of my father and 18 guests, grabbed Wyatt by the wrist hard enough to leave 4 small bruises I photographed 2 days later and said, "Did you take Grandpa's watch? Were you jealous because he showed it to Paisley?" Wyatt didn't answer. He looked at the floor the way he does when an adult's voice gets a certain edge to it. My father, in front of 18 people, said the sentence I have now heard, replayed, and paused frame by frame more times than I can count. "We don't keep thieves in this family. You want to sit somewhere cold and think about what you did, you can do it in the boathouse." Wyatt did not cry. He walked to the mudroom, put on his coat and his boots without being told twice, and walked out into the snow toward the boathouse 30 yards from the back door. My father followed him, opened the boathouse door, and turned the padlock at 8:04 p.m. Wyatt was inside for 2 hours and 40 minutes before anyone opened that door again. I arrived at 8:40, 36 minutes into it, and no one told me. My mother met me at the door with a smile that didn't reach past her mouth and said Wyatt was resting in the guest room upstairs. I believed her for 45 minutes because it did not occur to me, standing in my parents' warm kitchen with a slice of birthday cake in front of me, that my son was 300 feet away in an uninsulated boathouse in a squall. The boathouse is a single-story structure my father built in 1994 to store the pontoon and the Chris craft over winter. Bare concrete floor, no heat, a bay door on the lakeside, and a regular side door facing the house, with a bank of narrow horizontal windows above the workbench that slide on an old aluminum track. The National Weather Service later confirmed the wind chill at the marina dropped to 11 degrees between 8:00 and 11:00 that night. Wyatt was wearing his coat, thank God, and his boots. He was not wearing gloves. I know what happened inside because the boathouse camera recorded all of it, audio and video, the way my father's cameras have recorded every corner of that property since he got nervous about break-ins in 2020. I have watched the full 2 hours and 40 minutes exactly once. I will describe it to you exactly once. For the first 20 minutes, Wyatt sat on the workbench stool and didn't move much. At 8:26, he took a hot hands packet out of his coat pocket, cracked it, and held it between his palms. At 8:31, he took out a second one. At 8:44, he started talking quietly to nobody, a habit I recognize now as the same thing I do when I'm alone in the clean room at 2 a.m., talking myself through a frame count. "It's okay," he said. "The ice always melts. Dad said so." At 9:10, he tried the side door. Locked. At 9:14, he tried the bay door latch, but it's counterweighted and he couldn't lift it. At 9:30, his shivering became visible on camera, his whole small body shaking in a rhythm I've since learned is called clonic shivering, a body's last organized attempt to generate its own heat before it starts to fail at that job. At 9:40, he stood up and walked to the Chris craft parked in the near bay, climbed onto the swim platform, and sat there instead, as though being a few feet higher off the concrete might matter. It didn't, but I understand the impulse. When you're that cold, your body starts making decisions your mind isn't fully steering. At 9:45, he coughed twice, a wet, low sound I recognize from 20 years of watching security footage of children in exactly the kind of trouble that ends in a hospital chart. At 9:48, he climbed back down and stood in the middle of the concrete floor for almost 4 full minutes, not moving at all, arms wrapped around himself, which is its own kind of warning sign. A child who has stopped trying things is a child whose body is starting to conserve energy for something more basic than comfort. At 9:52, he did something that still takes my breath when I think about it. He walked to the workbench, climbed up on the stool, and looked at a laminated index card taped to the inside of the cabinet door above the bench. A card his father, Dean, had put there 14 months earlier during one of his engineer brain safety lessons, the kind Dean gives Wyatt about smoke detectors and seatbelts, and apparently boathouse windows. The card read, "In Dean's block printing, if you're ever stuck in here, push up on the bottom track of the side window, don't pull sideways. It'll slide out of the frame. Love you, buddy." Dad. Dean had shown him exactly once, that same afternoon, as a game, the way you teach a kid to find a fire exit in a hotel. Wyatt read it, or read enough of it, Dad and stuck and window, climbed onto an overturned 5-gallon bucket, pushed up on the window track exactly the way the card said, and the aluminum frame popped loose and dropped 6 inches out of its channel. He pushed the whole window out onto the snow outside, folded himself through a gap I would not have believed an 8-year-old's shoulders could fit through, and dropped 4 feet down into a snowbank at 10:03 p.m. He did not go back to the house. He told a deputy later that he didn't want Grandpa to be mad that the window came out, which is its own quiet devastation. Instead, he walked along the unplowed shoulder of Marina Road, away from the house, toward the orange glow of a gas station a half-mile down, in 18 inches of new snow, in boots that were not rated for that kind of cold, for 26 minutes. At 10:11, Alma Petrakis, checking her own storm shutters, saw a small shape moving along the road in her headlights and thought at first she was seeing things. She followed in her car, lost him twice in the blowing snow, and found him finally sitting on the curb outside the Marathon station on Division Road at 10:31, 4 minutes after a 19-year-old clerk named Dominic Reyes had already called 911. Dominic told the dispatcher he'd been restocking the coffee station when the door chimed and a barefoot, one boot had come off somewhere in the snow, child walked in with snow packed into the cuffs of his coat and said, "My grandpa locked the boathouse." I want my mom. Dominic wrapped him in his own Northern Michigan University hoodie and sat with him behind the counter with the space heater turned toward them both, feeding him small sips of warm decaf because it was the only warm thing within reach, until the ambulance arrived at 10:41. He later told the responding EMT he almost hadn't heard the door chime over the radio, that if he'd had his earbuds in like most nights, Wyatt might have sat down on that curb in the snow for a lot longer before anyone noticed him at all. Alma stayed the whole time, standing just inside the station door in her bathrobe and boots, because, in her words, somebody's grandmother needed to be in that room, and it wasn't going to be the one who should have been. I was in my parents' living room at 10:41, eating a slice of birthday cake I could not taste, still believing my son was resting upstairs. At 10:52, a Charlevoix County deputy called my father's house phone to inform the family that a hypothermic child matching Wyatt's description had been found and transported to McLaren, Northern Michigan in Petoskey. My mother took the call in the kitchen with her back to the room. When she hung up, her face had gone the color of the countertop. She told my father there'd been some kind of mix-up and that Wyatt had been found outside. She did not, in that moment, tell either me or my father the word Boathouse. I found that out from the deputy directly, 40 minutes later, standing in the ER hallway. Before I tell you what I found when I finally got my hands on that footage myself, I want to say this plainly, because I think some of you watching already know why it matters. If a story your family tells you about your own child doesn't match the child's own words, believe the child first and ask questions second. If you're new here, this is Paper Trail Justice, and I build my life around exactly that instinct. So subscribe. And tell me in the comments if you've ever had to choose between a family's version of events and your own kids. I promise you the paper trail is always there. You just have to be willing to pull it. Act 4. I drove to McLaren with my hands shaking too hard to use my own turn signal properly. Dr. Priya Anand met me outside Wyatt's room in the pediatric ER. Mrs. Callahan, his core temperature on arrival was 93.8. We've got him on warmed Roman-4 fluids and a bear hugger warming blanket. Mild frostnip on 3 fingers of his left hand, nothing requiring more than time. He's going to be all right. Then, more carefully, he told the triage nurse his grandfather locked him in a boathouse. I want you to know that's in his chart exactly as he said it. I sat with my son. He was awake enough to ask for the stuffed narwhal Dominic Reyes had bought him from the gas station's own toy rack before the ambulance left. A detail that still undoes me more than almost anything else in this story. I held Wyatt's hand and did not cry because I was not yet done being useful. Deputy Marcus Aldrich came in at 11:50 with a clipboard and the careful voice of a man reading a report he already suspects doesn't hold together. My father had told him Wyatt must have let himself out the back door during the confusion over the missing watch. My mother had told him Wyatt confessed to taking it and got upset and ran off. Marisol had told him her daughter saw Wyatt near the coat closet earlier that evening. Wyatt had told the paramedics, verbatim, "Grandpa locked the boathouse. I didn't take the watch. I want my mom." "Ma'am," Deputy Aldrich said, "the family's version and your son's version don't line up, and neither one lines up with the time gap between when your father says Wyatt disappeared and when he was found 4/10 of a mile away. I'd like to keep digging, and I understand your father has security cameras on the property." I told him about both cameras, the boathouse one my father had shown me himself 2 winters ago, proud of the resolution, and the mudroom one I'd noticed the wiring for but never asked about. I told him my father would consent to a full pull of the footage the moment I asked him to. Deputy Aldrich looked almost relieved. "Ma'am, that helps me more than you know. My father walked into that hospital room at 1:15 a.m. He had spent 2 hours driving the back roads around the marina believing he was looking for a grandson who'd wandered off during a squall, because my mother had never told him about the window, the walk, or the boathouse's true role in any of it, only that Wyatt was outside somewhere. He stood in the doorway with snow still melting off his coat, looked at the frostnip bandage on Wyatt's hand, and said, "Charlotte, he still calls me that sometimes, my middle name, the one he used when I was in trouble as a kid. Is he going to be all right?" I handed him the deputy's preliminary report without a word. He read it twice. His hand started to shake on the 3rd line. "This says boathouse. This says almost 3 hours. Your camera was running, Dad." I opened the clip Deputy Aldrich had already forwarded to my phone from the Boathouse system, 11 seconds of my father turning that padlock at 8:04 p.m. and walking away. My father pressed his palm flat against the hallway wall to keep himself upright. He stood like that for a long time. Then he said the only thing he could manage, "I need to see all of it. I need you to come back to the house with me right now." We drove back together at 2 a.m., neither of us speaking. My mother was asleep, or pretending to be, in the room she and Marisol had spent the evening in after the deputies left. My father let me into his office. The NVR was a unit he'd bought himself in 2020 after a break-in scare, and he still knew how to run it better than most of my clients' IT departments. We pulled the Boathouse footage together, start to finish. I watched my son sit alone in the cold for 2 hours and 40 minutes with my father sitting silently beside me, and neither of us said a word until it ended with Wyatt disappearing through a gap in a window frame. "Now pull the mudroom camera," I told him. Same night, from 6 p.m. That's where I saw Paisley take the watch, 11 seconds, unmistakable, at 7:19 p.m., 41 minutes before anyone accused my son of anything. I sat with that footage for a long moment before I told my father what he was looking at. He put both hands over his face. Then I did the part of this that is, honestly, just my job. The next morning, at the family's insistence that Wyatt must have done something to make Paisley think that, my mother produced a third clip on her own phone. A 22-second video, she said, showed Wyatt hovering by the coat closet, looking guilty, earlier that same evening, time-stamped 7:12 p.m. 7 minutes before the real mudroom footage showed Paisley alone. I am a certified forensic video examiner. I have spent 6 years testifying about exactly this kind of file. I opened that 22-second clip on a proper workstation instead of a phone screen, and it took me under 10 minutes to find what I was looking for. The file's container metadata showed it had been re-encoded through a screen recording app 3 days after the original footage's file creation timestamp, meaning someone had played back old footage on a monitor and recorded the monitor, not exported the original file. There were 4 duplicated frames at the 6-second mark, the unmistakable fingerprint of someone pausing a video, scrubbing back, and rejoining 2 different moments so the seam wouldn't show at normal playback speed. The overlaid timestamp burned into the corner didn't match the NVR's actual internal clock drift, which I'd already benchmarked against the Boathouse and mudroom files. Off by 4 minutes and 11 seconds, a gap that exists only if you build a fake timestamp by hand instead of letting the system generate it. My mother had taken real footage of Wyatt from an entirely different evening, a Tuesday 2 weeks earlier, when he'd stood by that same closet looking for his own boots, and spliced it against a doctored timestamp to make it look like he'd been casing the coat closet the night the watch disappeared. She had built, frame by frame, on her own phone, using an app she'd apparently learned from a video editing tutorial, evidence against her own grandson. I didn't stop at one method, because a good examiner never trusts a single flag. I ran the clip's compression structure a second way, checking the group of pictures pattern against every other file that same NVR had ever produced. Every genuine clip off that system writes in an identical, machine-generated rhythm, the same interval between key frames, down to the millisecond, because it's the camera's own firmware doing the writing, not a person. My mother's clip broke that rhythm twice, in exactly the 2 places where I'd already flagged a splice by eye. 2 independent methods agreeing on the same 2 seems isn't a coincidence I could argue my way around in a courtroom. And it wasn't one I could argue my way around at my parents' kitchen island either. There was one more thread, and it came from Marisol's own phone, which she handed over herself 2 days later, shaking, after Grant's attorney had already subpoenaed her call and message records for the custody matter. A text chain from November 9th, 5 days before the party. My mother had written, "If anything ever comes up missing, we already know who people will believe." Marisol had answered with a single word: Wyatt. Nobody had planned the watch specifically. What they had planned, in writing, 5 days ahead of time, was who would be blamed for whatever went wrong. I laid all of it out on my parents' kitchen island 2 days later. The deputy's report, stills from the real Boathouse and mudroom footage, my written forensic breakdown of the doctored clip's re-encode signature and frame duplication, and one more thing, a listing I'd found at 6 a.m. That morning on a regional buy-sell trade marketplace, posted 11 days after the watch went missing, from an account under the name M. Ford 1988. A gold pocket watch, engraved case back, vintage, estate piece, no questions. Reverse image search matched the engraving to a photo my father had taken of the watch in 2021 for an insurance appraisal. The listing had sold 4 days later for $600, picked up in person at a coffee shop in Grand Rapids, 11 miles from Marisol's old house. I called Marisol's number and put it on speaker in front of my parents. "You sold Grandpa's watch on Marketplace under an account with your maiden initials and your birth year," I said. $600, picked up in Grand Rapids, 4 days before Grant's attorney filed for an updated custody hearing over your gambling debt. "Do you want to tell Mom and Dad, or should I?" There was a long silence, and then Paisley's voice, small, in the background on Marisol's end, because apparently she'd been sitting right there. "Mommy, you said Grandma said it was okay. You said Grandma said Wyatt would just get in trouble for a little bit and it would be fine." My mother's face did something I have genuinely never seen it do before. It simply stopped performing. "Mom," I said. "Why?" She was quiet for almost a full minute before the answer came, and when it did, it wasn't in the voice she'd used on me for 33 years. "Your sister was going to lose everything, Josephine. The house, the custody hearing, all of it over money she panicked and can't pay back. Wyatt has you. He has Dean. Paisley has no one if Marisol loses this hearing." I thought if the watch just quietly disappeared into the story we already had, that Wyatt gets a little too much attention taken off him sometimes, no one would look hard enough to find where it actually went. "You built a fake video, Mom. You locked an 8-year-old outside in a squall to protect a story." "I didn't think it would go that far," she said. "Your father was supposed to just send him to his room." My father had not spoken in almost 10 minutes. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, the same one he uses for engine order lists, and he'd been writing on it the entire time. He turned it around and slid it across the island to me. It read, "Monday, open Wyatt an individual trust account, name Josephine and Dean as trustees. Return proceeds of watch sale, my own funds, not joint. Call Miles Ostrander revised will, remove joint signing authority on my accounts. Full statement review, all withdrawals since January." He looked up. "I gave your mother signing authority on everything after my hip surgery in the spring because it was easier than fighting the paperwork myself. I never once looked at a statement afterward. She's been handling $400 a month in cash withdrawals since June that I never questioned. And I'd bet my boat that's where a good part of your sister's gambling debt actually got covered before Grant ever found the credit line." He looked at my mother. "I'm going to need to see every statement since January, Debbie. Tonight." He called Miles Ostrander from the kitchen phone at 9 that same evening, an accountant who has done my father's taxes since 1998, and asked him to come by Monday morning with every account statement the firm had on file, not just the summaries my mother had been generating by hand on the same yellow legal pad she used for grocery lists. Miles arrived at 9 a.m. sharp with a banker's box. It took him and my father 4 hours at that same kitchen island to reconcile 11 months of numbers. $2,140 had moved out of my father's personal checking account in cash withdrawals between June and November, in amounts small enough, 200 here, 300 there, that no single one of them would have triggered a bank's fraud alert, and consistent enough that Miles said, flatly, it was the kind of pattern he only ever saw in one context. Someone managing a number down slowly enough that nobody upstream would ever ask about it at once. A caseworker from the county's child welfare office, a soft-spoken man named Terrence Wu, had already opened a file the morning after the ER report came in. Standard procedure anytime a minor is treated for exposure with a caregiver named in the chart. He called me on the 17th, asked 4 questions, listened carefully to all 4 answers, and told me the file would stay open 90 days as a precaution, with a follow-up home visit scheduled for early December. He thanked me for being specific with times and dates. The whole call took under 9 minutes. The system, once it had real information instead of a family's summary of itself, moved faster than my family ever had. I did not stay to watch the rest of it happen at the island. I knelt down next to Paisley, who was crying now, and told her that telling the truth, even 4 days late, was still the hardest and best thing she'd done all month, and that her cousin would forgive her in his own time, and she should be patient with both of them while that happened. Then I drove back to McLaren, where Wyatt was already asking, for the third time that day, if he could go home. ACT 5, Wyatt was discharged the next afternoon. Dr. Anand gave him a paper crane folded from an EKG printout, which he held the whole ride home. "Mom, am I going back to Grandma's?" "No, baby, we're going home. Just us." The window from the boathouse. My father had it repaired within the week, the same aluminum track slider, and taped a new laminated card inside the cabinet, this one in his own handwriting under Dean's original. "Your dad was right. I'm sorry it took this to prove it. Grandpa." He drove it to our house himself on a Wednesday, along with the original window frame Wyatt had pushed loose, which he'd kept. I don't fully know why, except that I think some part of him needed to hold the actual object his grandson had used to save himself. On that visit, he also handed me an envelope with $600 in cash, the exact amount the watch sold for, from his own separate account, and a folder from Miles Ostrander's office confirming Wyatt as an irrevocable trust beneficiary, with Dean and me as trustees. "I can't give him back the 2 hours and 40 minutes, my father said, standing on our porch, not stepping past the mat. "This is what I can give him." Then he knelt down, slowly, because of his hip, to Wyatt's height without touching him, and said the thing I'll remember on the day I die. "Buddy, I said something terrible to you in front of a lot of people, and it wasn't true, and it was never about you. Your dad taught you exactly the right thing to do if you were ever stuck somewhere, and you did it, and you saved yourself, and I am so proud of you and so sorry in that order forever." Wyatt, very quietly, "Is Grandma still mad at me?" "No, buddy. Grandma was never mad at you. Grandma was scared of the wrong thing, and I let her be. You didn't do anything wrong, not one thing." Dean came home from Fort McCoy 6 days after the storm. I told him everything in the driveway before he'd even gotten his duffel out of the truck, and he sat down on the tailgate and put his face in his hands for a long minute before he asked to see the window card. He read his own handwriting like it belonged to someone else. "I taught him that on a Tuesday like it was a game," he said. That night he retaped both cards, his and my father's, to the wall of Wyatt's room, side by side above the bed. Wyatt went back to Pedosky Elementary the Monday after Thanksgiving. Ms. Ostrowski met him at the classroom door and, without making anything of it in front of the other kids, opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside was a small bin of hot hands packets and a spare pair of children's gloves in 3 sizes. "This is your warm-up drawer," she told him. "Anytime you're cold, you come get one. You don't have to explain why." By the second week of December, 4 other classrooms at the school had started their own. Ms. Ostrowski told me later she'd stopped assuming a quiet kid with cold hands was just a quiet kid with cold hands, and she wasn't planning on going back to assuming that about anybody again. Marisol's custody hearing was moved up 2 weeks after Grant's attorney learned about the marketplace sale and the missing family funds, which, once my father finally reviewed 6 months of statements with an actual accountant, turned out to total closer to $2,200 beyond the watch, all of it quietly withdrawn between June and November. Paisley now lives with Grant full-time, with supervised weekends at my parents' house, never unsupervised, on my father's own new house rule, which he told my mother flatly was non-negotiable. I have not had a full conversation with my mother since the kitchen island. She has sent 2 letters. I've kept them in a drawer, unopened, for Wyatt to decide about someday, on his own timeline, not mine or hers. The first night home from the hospital, Wyatt couldn't fall asleep alone, so I dragged the rug from our hallway into his room and lay down on it in my clothes. "Mom, are you going to leave?" he asked, somewhere around midnight. "No, baby, I'm choosing to stay. That's different from just not leaving yet." "Okay," he said, like that distinction meant something to him, and I think it did. A week later he handed me a drawing at breakfast instead of leaving it taped to the fridge like he used to. A boat, no ice around it, sailing in open water with a smaller boat right alongside it, both of them lit up yellow like the sun was directly overhead. "Who's the big boat?" I asked. "You," he said. "Who's the small one?" "Me, but also Dad, kind of, because Dad taught me how to get out, so some of him is still in the boat with me, even when he's far away." I taped that one next to the 2 laminated cards on his wall, and some mornings I still stand in his doorway just to look at all 3 of them together. I learned 3 things that November. My mother taught me that love in her house had always come with a ledger nobody else was allowed to audit. I will teach my son that love and evidence aren't supposed to be enemies, that the people who love you shouldn't need you to stop asking questions. My father taught me that a person can be wrong about what matters for most of a lifetime and still choose, on one freezing Tuesday, to finally look at the actual statement instead of the summary he'd been handed. I won't waste that on bitterness. And Dean, half a state away with no way to call home, still managed to reach through a storm and get our son out of a locked room with 4 sentences taped to a cabinet door. Because some of the most important evidence a person ever leaves behind isn't a video file. It's a habit you built into somebody small enough to need it later. If you have ever watched a video a family handed you and felt, in your stomach before your brain caught up, that something in it didn't sit right, I see you. If you've ever sat in your car outside a house you grew up in, trying to decide whether you were overreacting to a quiet kid and a string of small excuses, I see you. If a child in your life has started collecting hand warmers, or drawing something frozen, or asking you in the rearview mirror why he can't be quiet enough for somebody, go look closer. Ask him to draw you the picture again. Ask him what the smile means. Wyatt is safe. That's the only paper trail that ever really mattered to me. The window works. The cards are on the wall. The storm is over. If this reminded you of someone you love, share it with them gently. If it reminded you of somebody you used to be, forgive her. She was doing her best with what she could see at the time. Subscribe to Paper Trail Justice if you'd like to sit with the next one. There are more of these stories than any of us want there to be, and I'll keep finding the paper trail in every one of them. We're not done speaking.